Now let's bring in retired four-star General Barry McCaffrey. He's an NBC News military analyst, also staff writer for The Atlantic and Applebaum. General, I'm curious your thought about SecDef Austin, Secretary of State Blinken, going to Ukraine, talking to Zelensky, and no longer talking about Zelensky and the Ukrainians surviving, but instead talking about victory, that they're in it to win it, and they're in it to degrade Russia's military forces so much that they can never attack Ukraine again. Quite a change, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very encouraging. Look, the Biden national security team is very powerful, experienced people. Secretary of the Treasury, CIA director, SecDef, SecState, very competent. They know what they're up to. Having the two of them on the ground personally with President Zelensky was really a statement of support. I think even more so is the announcement of the return of diplomats to Kyiv. We simply got to get back there on the ground, have a military liaison cell, have diplomats, and stay engaged. So good news, along with, thank God, the re-election of Macron in France. Had France fallen out of NATO over time, it would have been a major blow to the 30-nation pact for defense against Russia.
Yeah. And your piece, I thought your piece was fascinating, as always. And you looked at Vladimir Putin, just incapable of understanding what was going on in Ukraine. I talked about David Kennedy's, went back and read some of David Kennedy's Rise and Fall of the Great Empires this past weekend to once again try to make sense of what was going on right now. And there's a portion in it where he talks about all of the great powers of the East, from Ming Dynasty, Ottoman Empire, Muscovy, Japan. All of these great empires could never imagine how this collection of states in Europe that were not top down but bottom up could somehow grow over the next 400 or 500 years into the most powerful force in the world. And we see that again with Vladimir Putin, as you say, can't imagine this desire for freedom in Ukraine. Instead, all he can do is suggest that they're somehow spies or neo-Nazis, they're plants, and for this ex-KGB agent, it's just beyond his comprehension. And his failure of imagination, has it not been his failing here?
Yes, no, I agree completely. He sees the world very much the way he was trained to see the world, namely that the only thing that matters is autocratic power, that everything else is fake or false, that anything that looks like a spontaneous street demonstration is being coordinated by somebody secretly somewhere. He sees conspiracy theories all around him. And the idea that Ukraine, which genuinely is a grassroots up society, Zelensky's a brilliant leader, but really what's happened in Ukraine is that ordinary people have joined the army. Ordinary people have joined the territorial defense forces. People are resisting in all kinds of ways without being asked to or without being coordinated by some, secret billionaire somewhere off in the distance. And he finds that very difficult to understand. And there's a lot of evidence now that he doesn't really understand the kinds of losses that his troops have endured when they invaded Ukraine from the north, and that he doesn't really understand what he's up against in the east. That doesn't mean that over the long term, Russia, which is a much larger state and has a much larger arsenal, can't do a huge amount of damage. And that's why it's so encouraging to see high-ranking U.S. officials inside the country talking about victory, because Ukrainians will need just the technical support in order to win. But it's really their war. They're conducting it. They're organizing it. They're deciding how to use those weapons.
So, Anne, for your latest piece for The Atlantic, which is out today, and you talk about your trip there, you're just back, entitled Ukraine and the Words That Lead to Mass Murder. And in it, you write in part, quote, in Putin's language, and in the language that most Russian television commentators, the Ukrainians have no agency. They can't make choices for themselves. They can't elect a government for themselves. They aren't even human. They are Nazis. And so, like the kulaks before them, they can be eliminated with no remorse. They succeeded. From the first days of the war, it was evidence that the Russian military had planned in advance for many civilians, perhaps millions, to be killed, wounded, or displaced from their homes in Ukraine. In full view of the world, the Russian state successfully hid this tragedy from its own people. As in the past, the use of jargon helped. This was not an invasion. It was a special military operation. This was not a mass murder of Ukrainians. It was protection for the inhabitants of the eastern Ukrainian territories. This was not genocide. It was defense against genocide perpetuated by the Kyiv regime.
And for a leader like Putin, who looks up to Joseph Stalin, well, killing civilians in Ukraine, that's nothing. That's just it for him. It's a return to norm. You wrote the book on the 3 million to 4 million Ukrainians that Stalin deliberately starved to death.
Look, it's impossible to watch this war and not feel creepy, eerie echoes of the past. Whether it's the language about the Ukrainians, Putin talks today about Ukrainians in a way that's similar to the way the Stalin regime spoke about so-called kulaks, meaning rich peasants. The way in which they use jargon, as I describe in the article, to hide from, not even from ordinary Russians, but even from the perpetrators themselves, what they're doing, to convince people that what they're doing has some legitimacy. All of these are very old tactics that we've seen before. The same kinds of old tactics that we're seeing when the Russians take over towns and cities in Ukraine. They murder the mayors. They use random violence on the population. They're now actually bringing in Soviet flags and statues of Lenin. This is very much what the Red Army did first in 1939 and then in 1945 when it invaded eastern Poland. So these are exactly the kinds of tactics we've seen before in the distant past.
Hey, General McCaffrey, it's Jonathan Lemire. I want to get your take on something that happened overnight. A large explosion and fire at an oil depot at Russia's city of Bryansk, which is just near the Ukrainian border, a fuel depot vital for Russian forces going into Ukraine. This comes on the heels of another military facility in Russia blowing up about a week or so back. Train lines that run from Russia to Ukraine damaged a few days ago as well. We know there's been talk of the Ukrainians trying to stage some sort of counteroffensive. What do you think's happening here? Are they reaching across the border and targeting some Russian facilities? Are this acts of sabotage back home? Or is this a lot of bad luck suddenly hitting the Russian forces at a time when they can't afford it?
Oh, we don't know. We should assume that the Ukrainians are and will continue to conduct very covert operations into the near Russian regions. There's a lot of not just oil transportation, rail networks, but also their S-400 anti-aircraft systems back there. So they're not off limits. But the bigger news, it seems to me, is that Russians continue to run a strategic air campaign. They've got 5 times the air power of the Ukrainians against the Ukrainian rail network and against Ukrainian oil facilities. We also should not lose sight of the fact that the big battle is coming. And that battle isn't to seize more terrain in the Donbass and Odessa. It's to destroy the Ukrainian army. So we're still, NATO and the global allies are still under pressure to try and give the Ukrainian military a force of maneuver and a capability for deep fires to successfully resist the Russians. The whole outcome, it seems to me, is still in some peril.
Yeah. So, General, with that in mind, obviously, Zelensky last week said that Biden had a good talk with Biden. Biden agreed to supply him weapon systems that he needed. From your understanding of what they have on the ground, what do they still need? What's the next step for the United States as we move forward to that phase?
Well, of course, part of the problem, part of the challenge for Secretary Austin and the Defense Department is the degree to which Ukrainians can absorb new weapon systems. Right now, thankfully, we've got 5 battalions of 155 modern artillery going in, along with a lot of ammunition. These are precision weapons. They can get out to as far as 40 miles and hit within 30 feet of their target. They're vital to countering Russian artillery. But that's not enough. We won't be able to get Apache attack helicopters in there. We can't get some of our most sophisticated air defense missile systems in there. They simply don't have the time to train or absorb them. So what I'm hopeful is that the Ukrainians are able to get modern tanks, not old T-72s from other Eastern European NATO allies, but a more modern tank system, and possibly deep fires, ATACMS missiles that can go out there 200 or more miles. The manpower on the two sides is roughly equivalent. The Russians have more reserves and more momentum. But again, the real battle is, can the Russians encircle Ukrainian forces in the east and destroy them? My guess is they can't. They're too disorganized. Their generals have failed in their operational plans. At the tactical level, the morale of the Russians is pretty low. So, but the whole question's in the offing.